Hello, this is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. I'm going to go over some changes that were made recently in the Monsters of the Multiverse for the DnD5e rule set. This pertains to the actual rules, not so much Fantasy Grounds, although Fantasy Grounds has been updated to accommodate some of these changes. So first and foremost, there are 4 major changes to the races that are provided in the Monsters of the Multiverse. I have them up here on the screen. You have the Furbolg, the Kobold, the Huan-Ti, and the Githyanki. All of these races have been either minorly or significantly changed, depending on what you are used to or what you know from before. So one of the things that I noticed is that these 4 races have been changed and updated for balance and for the new updated rule changes that are coming. The player's handbook will be updated in 2024. So for the Furbolg magic, you are able to use intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. So this is chose when you first select the race, and then you can decide which one of those 3 abilities that you want to base your magic on. You can also use your Furbolg magic and burn up spell slots if you choose to do so. So this is a deviation across the board. This is also true of the Githyanki psionics and of the Serpentine spellcasting, which is related to the Huan-Ti racing. So the races are changed in that regard. The other thing is that there are different things that have changed slightly in wording. So there's not a whole lot of big changes, but you'll notice some things right away, like the Kobold can no longer use pack tactics. They've taken that away. But they've also taken away the sunlight sensitivity. So it kind of balanced it out, but those are some changes that were made. Also, you have the Kobold Legacy, you have the Defiance, Craftiness. So these are kind of like things that you would get with Kobold that are kind of a little bit more improved or maybe added to what was before to kind of balance out some of these major changes. The one that's changed the most is the Huan-Ti. You have advantage on saving throws against spells. And then Poison Resilience is you have advantage to make a save. You don't have resistance anymore on poison, so that's a big change. Like I said, the spell casting has changed a little bit. You can use intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. You have to choose that when you're building your character, and then you can use spell slots to cast those if you run out of your daily usages. So there's some good things and such. The Githyankis have a similar thing with their psionic abilities. And they also now have psychic resilience, so they have resistance to psychic damage. It doesn't come up a lot, but if you're fighting against other creatures that use psionic abilities, that might be something that would help you. So mainly those are the main changes that I've noticed. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to play with these or adopt them. This just means that going forward with newer players, that they may not even know the difference because they didn't know what was available in the other sources. So you can use your older books if you already own them. You just won't be able to go retroactively backwards if you're somebody that's new to Fantasy Grounds or to D&D. So these are things that'll change eventually across the board. They might even change some of the base races in the future, so just be prepared for that. These are just things that are coming down the pipe that have already kind of taken place through the releases that have come out. This does not mean you can't use the older stuff. It's just like people using older editions. You can't stop them from using those. They own those. They have every right to use them. It's just that these changes are now new going forward. These are not options. These are the actual changes. So when you are getting new content from here on out, you will start seeing more and more of this and less of the older stuff. So that's just the caveat of that. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about is that you might also have some NPC differences. So I took the Necromancer Wizard out of the Monsters of the Multiverse book, and then I took an Archmage because they're very similar in regards to how they're built. So you have the stat blocks that have recently changed. Smiteworks has updated them to be accommodating for the newer format. As you'll see, the bonus proficiency is applied right at the front of the page. The actions are pretty similar, except for now, all of the spell casting is innate. So there is no spell casting levels anymore. It's more or less more like a power instead of a spell. You don't have your traditional spell slots anymore on the newer stat blocks. Now, this doesn't mean you can't use the older ones. These older ones will still work. Matter of fact, this stat block still shows the older spell casting slots. But anything going forward will now be basically defined by a at will type thing instead of spell slots when it comes to casting spells. So they'll all be considered innate spells, not just the few racial or whatever they have on as far as the build. But as you can see, that changed a little bit. So instead of having leveled spells here, now they're all innate spells. They still have a spell level, but they don't track them the same exact way as you would in a traditional stat block. So that's changed a little bit. It tells you how many per day that you get here, whereas this, you actually had slots to choose from. This actually lists how many times per day you get to use these. So what they've done is they've cleaned up the stat blocks to make them a little bit easier to run instead of basically running a character. That's kind of what the aim was, is to get away from having this big list of spells that you have to manage and going into more, okay, these are the main spells that this character is going to use. And then any of the utility spells, they're going to place them on a list that you can choose from as well. So like Dimension Door, Mage Armor, those sort of things are more or less things that they may or may not use depending on the situation. But they do list a lot of the more, attack or save-based things like Bestow Cursed. So they kind of featured the offensive and the defensive things, and then a lot of the utility things, they've kind of put those in the background in a list that you can choose from. So the utility spells don't really have a full listing like you would in a traditional stat block. So it just kind of depends on what your definition of utility and such is. But they're still there. It's just a little bit different the way it's presented. The other thing is that if you go to the other tab, you'll notice that there's a little bit more information on the particular higher level NPCs. You'll find a lot more information. And then you'll see that they have a multi-attack, so they have these burst attacks, arcane bursts, whereas that's not something you would see. And then their bonus actions, they can summon a dead, and then they have a reaction listed back here. Whereas a lot of these were listed in a traditional stat block near the front of the sheet, and these tend to kind of get buried into the stat blocks, whereas these ones are a little bit more, they stand out a little bit more. The only thing is it's another tab, so just remember to look there, especially on these higher level, newer NPC stat blocks. There'll be a lot more information on the back. So this one, they just show a picture and a brief description, which comes from the monster manual. But over here on the left, this comes from Monsters of the Multiverse, and it has a lot more information on the back than traditional. So these are some changes that I've noticed straight away that have been implemented with Monsters of the Multiverse. So those are just some of the subtle things that you'll find. Some of them are dramatic. It doesn't change the fact that you can still use the older ones. It's just that going forward, the magic, the way it's set up for NPCs is going to be a lot different. So this does not go across to players the same way, so that players are still pretty much treated the same manner as far as spell slots go. They just wanted to make NPCs a lot less like running another character and more like running an NPC monster. And that's sort of what they've done here, is they've optimized. So they have the Arcane Burst listed here as an attack and a ranged attack. They have some things on here that are their most common usage, and some of the things they wanted to bring that up to the front so that when you're using this NPC, it's a little bit more obvious. But instead of digging into the stat block and having to find everything, they wanted to bring some of those more deadly and more useful spells to the forefront to make these NPCs a lot more powerful and a lot more usable. So that's kind of what the reason was. I don't know if I agree with it or not. I just know that the changes were made, and that going forward, a lot of these will be that way. So when you get new content, you'll start noticing these new stat blocks. Now, the older stat blocks still work. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just letting you know that some of the changes that are coming out. The player's handbook will change some of the other base races. I don't know how much or what will change, but I know that the drow will probably most definitely change, and some of the other more arcane or kind of non-human races. So that's the main changes is stat blocks and like 4 of the player races. You'll notice also that when you're building characters, you won't need quite as an extensive library if you own everything. So if you just want what you need for building characters and you're going to use the new Monsters of the Multiverse, you technically only need the Player's Handbook, the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, Fizban's, Saltmarsh, Monsters of the Multiverse, Tasha's, Tomb of Annihilation players, Van Richten's players, and Xanathar's Guide. Only a few of these add actual racial options. Most of these are backgrounds or classes or such. So there are only a few changes to actual books that you'll need, but you don't need the Turtle package anymore. You don't need Elemental Evil. You don't need the Mordenkainen's, and you don't need the Witchlight module anymore. A lot of those are already included in these. So like the Herongon, the Owlin, I believe those are in Monsters of the Multiverse. So if you open up the player side and you go to races, these are all the races that are included. So these are all the non-standard races or sub-races. And I think that the new format for Fantasy Grounds going forward is going to be all sub-races and subclasses instead of having to rely on the base and then having a sub of that. I think they're going to expand it out so that when you create a race or when you select a race, it's actually going to call on the base instead of the other way around. The base is going to call for the sub-race. So it has something to do with the way they're structuring the data. But nonetheless, these are all the races that are included in Monsters of the Multiverse. All the Player's Handbook races are still there. They haven't changed yet, but they are due to change in 2024. So if it's something you're concerned about, you have to write to Wizards of the Coast. They are the ones who made the changes. So this is the races that are included in the Player's Handbook. And then there's one in Tasha's, which is the variant, or in this the one with all the choices. So you have the races in here, which are basically custom lineage. So those are the main races here. So I imagine the Tiefling, the human variant, the sub-race for Drow will change. They'll probably rebalance the different non-human races in here. Dragonborn are kind of fixed or at least addressed more in Fizban's. So if you own Fizban's, you're going to have more sub-races of the Dragonborn. So there's Chromatic, Gem, and Metallic instead of just a base Dragonborn. So there's some few changes there, but other than that, those are what I've noticed the most. So if you are upset or mad about that, you need to write to Wizards of the Coast. I will put the link in the description of where you can write to. So this was not a Smiteworks Fantasy Grounds decision. This was a decision made on top by Hasbro. And that's flowed down to all the different rule sets. So whether you play Fantasy Grounds or Roll20 or even the newer Boundary, we'll find this will be true as time goes on. So there's really not much else you can do. And also D&D Beyond has changed as well. So at any rate, I hope this helps you a little bit. These are just kind of some heads up. No need to panic, just to let you know what's going on. Take care, everyone. Have a good, safe holiday weekend, and I'll see you around the community. Bye-bye.